Okay, everybody, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. See if we can get this started. There we go. All right. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about utility billing for manufactured home parks and floating home marinas. Um, Again, my name is Samantha Sheehan. I am an attorney with the Oregon Law Center, and I represent solely tenants who live in these manufactured home parks and floating home marinas. My position is funded through a special assessment that is paid for by you guys, so by facility tenants. You pay $10 a year, and that's what goes into this big pot, and that funds these services for you guys. Again, this applies only to facility tenants. That means that you own your manufactured home or your floating home and you live in a park or marina, which is essentially 4 spaces for rent that are pretty close together. There's specific spacing requirements, but that's pretty much what you need to know. If you're living in a park with a landlord, you rent your space, you own your home, and you've got at least 4 neighbors, then you're probably in a park. A caveat, this is not legal advice. I cannot provide anyone here with legal advice. That means that what I'm doing right now is giving you legal information. So we're going to go over the statutes, the requirements, some of the impacts. But I cannot apply the law that we're going to discuss today to the facts of your specific legal issue. So if you do need legal advice, I highly suggest that you reach out to your local legal aid office. Each county in Oregon is covered by a legal aid office. Legal aid offices do provide free legal services. However, you do have to qualify both financially and based on the issue that you have. Right now, I am at capacity, so I am not taking new cases, most likely through the end of the year. But you can always reach out to me. You can reach out to MMCRC, and we will do our best to get those referrals out to people who've got the capacity to take it on. Oh, duplicate slide. All right. So there's a few different ways that your landlord is allowed to bill you for utilities in parks. So the first and the most simple is through direct billing, which just means that you contract with the service provider directly, and then the service provider provides you with that utility and they provide you with the bill, and then you pay that bill to the utility provider. Your landlord is not involved in the provision of that utility and is not involved in the billing for that utility. This is definitely the most straightforward billing method, and the one that we see the least amount of problems with because it's not in your landlord's hands, right? Excuse me. So the second way is called rent included billing. This used to be very common in Oregon, but has since become less common because water, as we know, has become more expensive. So where it used to be affordable for a landlord to provide the park with water and just have a slightly higher rent amount so that they could cover that cost for the park, that's really become untenable for landlords. So we don't see this quite as often as we used to. But essentially rent included billing, right, is that the service or utility provider provides that utility to the whole park. So you've got water, electric, all of those things in your home. But the landlord is billed for the entire park from the utility provider. And rather than the landlord providing you with a bill so that you're paying back what the service provider charged to your landlord just bakes that cost into your rent amount. Your rent remains the same every single month, right? So they can't say, okay, well, your utilities were more expensive in February than they were in January, so your rent is going to be higher in February. That's not allowed, right? It has to be a fixed rent amount. And the rent increase laws do apply. So your landlord can still only increase your rent once a year and only up to that statutory maximum amount. Some of the more common billing methods that we see in parks, pro rata billing. So this is where the service provider provides the utility to the entire park and to each tenant's space, and the landlord is the one who's billed for the entire usage of the park. However, rather than under rent included billing where they're baking that cost into your rent, the landlord is actually going to take that full cost of providing the utilities to the park and split it up among tenants in a way that is fair. What we call this is pass-through billing. It means that you're the one that's receiving the utility, but the landlord is the one that is being billed for it. So the landlord is passing through that bill from the utility provider to the tenant. And again, pro rata billing just means that they're splitting up the entire amount of the utility cost um, in a specific way. So there are different ways that you can split things up under pro rata. Probably the most common is by each rented space. So if you have 100 spaces in your park, you receive a utility bill, or the landlord receives a utility bill for $100, and the pro rata share for each individual space would be $1, right? Obviously, that's a very low amount and not what you're going to see, but I'm terrible at math, so that was for me. All right, and then the last legal billing method, and probably maybe the most common, something that we're definitely seeing landlords favor and trying to switch over to sub-meter billing, and that is sub-meter billing, as I mentioned. So this is where the service provider provides that utility to the entire park, and the bill is provided to the landlord for the entire park. The utility provider is going to measure the usage based on a master meter for the entire park. The landlord will have sub-meters installed on each individual space, and those sub-meters will measure the usage for each space, right? So under sub-meter billing, you're going to be charged for your usage. Your landlord is still going to be charging you for that usage, right? Because the landlord is paying for the entire park's usage, then they'll bill you for your usage, and that's how they'll be able to recoup the amount charged by the service provider. Now, it's important to note that under both pro rata billing and under sub-meter billing, your landlord can include other charges, and we'll talk a little bit about what those are, but it's, your bill may include more charges other than just your usage under sub-meter billing or just your share of that specific utility under pro rata. Like I said, there are requirements for including those additional charges, and we'll talk a little bit about those as we go on. So some general principles that are really important to remember as you go through these statutes and discuss the law. First is that a utility or service charge is not rent or a fee. That means that your landlord cannot issue you a notice of termination for non-payment of rent, but they can issue you a notice of termination for cause for failing to pay this fee, or excuse me, for failing to pay this charge, right? So terminations for non-payment of rent operate under different rules than terminations for cause. And part of those differences is that the termination for non-payment of rent has a shorter timeline. So the fact that these do not fall under rent is really important to note, because the consequence of that is that you are receiving actually more protections under the law for failing to pay this, right? So the notice of termination for cause is a 30-day notice and has to include an opportunity to cure. So if the issue is, right, that you didn't pay a utility or service charge, then what your landlord has to do is issue you a notice of termination. It would say 30-day notice for cause. It will explain, in November, Samantha Sheehan did not pay her utility charge of $86.97. This is your notice that if you do not pay this within the next 30 days, then your rental agreement will terminate and we have the right to file an eviction against you in court. That means that you then have those next 30 days, right, until that termination date to pay that utility bill, to pay that cost. And then if you do that within those 30 days, you're going to avoid termination. And so that means that your landlord then cannot file an eviction against you based on that notice of termination. It is important to note, though, that those notices for cause, there is a term in the law that allows your landlord to issue a repeat notice for cause. So if this happens, say this happened in November, your landlord gave you the notice later in November, and say it's going to expire on December 15th of this year, right? That means that from January, February, March, April, May, you need to make sure that you're paying your utility bill on time, because if you don't, your landlord does have the right to issue a repeat notice for cause, and that does not include an opportunity to cure. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but I do just want to note that the legislature did pass a new law that does include protections for terminations for non-payment, not just terminations for non-payment of rent, but terminations for non-payment of any kind. That includes those terminations for non-payment under the 30-day notice. And that part of that law gives you the opportunity to pay off that amount that you owe all the way up until your trial. So it has to be before trial, right? You can't go to trial and then pretty much lose and then say, oh, here you go, landlord, right? You have to do it before the trial starts. But this is a brand new law. You used to not have the opportunity to what we call cure or fix the eviction once the cure date ran out, right? So once your notice was over, you're kind of out of luck, right? You can't cure it can't avoid eviction by just paying the amount. The law changed. It now does allow you to avoid eviction by paying the amount. So even if you do get that repeat notice, there may be an opportunity for you to pay the amount and avoid eviction in that case. However, I would like to say it's always better to avoid getting these notices in the first place. And so knowing that failure to pay your utility bill may result in getting a notice. And so it's just something that you want to take seriously and make sure that you're paying that on time. So a written bill is required unlike rent, where rent is always due on the date that it said it's due in your rental agreement, without the landlord ever needing to demand that payment, right? Once you move in, once you sign a rental agreement, that rent is automatically due, whether your landlord tells you that it's due, provides you with a written bill or not, right? So that's always going to be due. Unlike rent, utilities are only due, your landlord can only require you to pay these utility charges if they provide you with a written bill. That written bill has to state the utility or service charge, like what it is, the amount of it, and the due date for the payment. These bills will often say that the due date is the day that you receive the payment. I believe that the law is written in that way to kind of reflect regular utility billing practices. If you had direct billing and you received a bill from your utility provider like PUD or EWEB or sub, right? They're going to say this is due upon receipt. So once you get it and you open it, you're supposed to pay it. But you do have that, but there's a grace period before it's considered late, right? And so because your landlord, in order to require you to pay this, would have to provide you with a 30-day notice, even though your bill says it's due that day, your landlord can't evict you can't do anything other than provide you with that notice of termination for failure to pay after that due date. And then again, like I said, you'll have those 30 days to be able to pay that. So it's a little bit strange, but that's just how that's what the law says. And these bills do require your charges to be itemized, right? So if you're paying sub-meter billing, say for water on your space, then there will need to be an entry for your water bill, right? So it'll have to say water, reflect the usage and the amount that you are paying that month for water. If you are, say, billed pro rata for garbage, you need to have another line on that bill that says garbage and the amount that you are due to pay for it. if your rental agreement requires that tenants pay a share of the common area utilities, again, that's going to have to be a separately itemized charge on that bill. So it would say common area utilities and the amount. Um, this the reason why this requirement exists is because under pro rata billing, right, they're taking the entire usage of the park and splitting that up among tenants. And so I think the fear was, right, that some of these additional charges might be added into that initial pot and then split up among tenants. And while tenants do have the opportunity to inspect the utility bills to make sure that they're being paid correct or being charged correctly, um, it can be difficult to figure out exactly um, exactly what everyone's amount is, right? Because under pro rata billing, you don't necessarily have to bill by space. You could bill, say, by occupants in each home. And if you don't know exactly how many occupants are in each and every home, doing that kind of math to determine whether your landlord is charging each person the right amount is going to be difficult, right? Because in order to do that math, you need to know how many people or how many occupants are living in the park that count towards that equation, right? Um, so this is part of the reason why your landlords have to itemize things to make it really clear for you and to allow you guys to really be able to check to make sure that things are being charged correctly. Even though that's difficult practically, that's why the law is there for that. Um, Again, if you receive a bill every month, I think this is pretty common in parks. I see this often where you get an invoice every month that will say, will list your space rent for the following month, list your utility charges for the previous month. It might list, a special assessment or something else that you might have to pay for like the installation of submeters or something. If that is all together on that same list as rent, it needs to be really clear that rent is separate than your utilities. And again, so non-payment of rent is in this category over here. This law, governs non-payment of rent. This law over here governs non-payment of a utility or service charge. So if your invoice total is say $1,000, but only $750 of that is your rent, and the other 250 are, utility or service charges, a parking spot, a storage fee, whatever it is, right? Your landlord can only demand that you pay that $750 through the non-payment of rent statute, right? So they can't reject your rent check if you send a rent check for $750, which is your space rent, even though your total invoice says $1,000. They have to accept your rent. They can't demand that your charges and fees be paid at the same time as your rent, right? Rent is due in a different way. Different laws apply. And I have seen landlords attempt to do this. Most of the time, landlords are pretty receptive when you say no to them, because it's pretty clear in the law that these are separate things, that there's a separate mechanism for collecting the utility or service charges. And while you can demand full payment of rent at one time, you can't demand full payment of rent plus these other charges or fees. They are separate payments, right? Inspection of utility bills. So this is really the linchpin for the tenant's ability to double check the landlord is doing things correctly. So if your landlord is using pro rata or sub-meter billing, meaning they're receiving the master bill and then they're splitting that master bill up among tenants, either based on your meter reading, so your usage, or based on some kind of a fair split up equation that they've determined and that's in your rental agreement, then they have to, number one, post the utility bill each month or each utility cycle, right? So sometimes utilities are charged quarterly, not monthly, right? So the requirement is not based on months, it's based on the billing period from the utility provider. But for most utilities, that is monthly. So they have to post those bills in a common area that includes an online location. So it could be put up in a portal or on a website. That is okay. It can also be posted in, the manager's office or near the mailboxes. It can really be posted. The where it's posted is pretty flexible. It's just that needs to be available for tenants. Tenants also have the right to inspect the past 12 months, and that actually is a 12-month requirement. So you're allowed to look at the past years, the past 1 year of utility bills, but you do have to provide written requests to your landlord before this will happen, right? You can't just walk into the manager's office and say, "Hey manager, I'd like to see all 12 months of this utility bill," right? That you have to give them some notice, and then your landlord will essentially create, you and your landlord will have to talk about a time and a date and a location to meet to go over the bills. They're not required to give you 12 months of this bill, right? They're not required to give you copies of these bills. What they're required to do is let you inspect them. I would argue that you could take pictures of them, particularly the bills that have been posted in a common area. I think there's no legal issue with taking photos of those. If you're in the manager's private office and you're looking at all of those 12 months of utility bills, I would ask for permission before you start taking pictures in that situation, just to be sure that you're not causing any additional animosity that might be going on. And if you're in a private location that is under the control of the manager, you may actually legally need their permission. But so the inspection of the utility bills, as I mentioned earlier, this is the way that you're going to be able to check that your landlord is dividing up those costs according to your rental agreement. And so, again, the way that you would do that, if you're under pro rata billing, you'd have to understand what the method for apportioning, what the method for splitting things up is. If it's by occupied space, then, you need to count up the spaces that are occupied by tenants. And then you would divide the full bill amount, which is the amount that would be posted by the landlord or that you were able to inspect, right? It's the provider's utility bill. So you take that amount and you would divide it up by the amount of occupied spaces. And then that should give you the amount that each tenant is charged for that utility. If that amount is different, then that's kind of a red flag, right? A red flag this is the time that I should probably pick up the phone and give somebody a call. Let's call legal aid. Let's call MMCRC. Let's see what's going on here because, my landlord's supposed to be splitting up my rent based on the occupied homes, and I got charged $100. And when I did the math, it should have been 50. So that's a pretty big discrepancy, right? And so that's really one of those times where you're going to want to, get those ears up and be like, I better go talk to somebody. Now, if you do the math and it's off by a couple dollars, that actually just might mean that the pro rata or the occupied spaces were counted maybe before someone else moved in or before someone moved out, right? And so that number is maybe off by 1 or 2 occupied spaces. There is an exception in the law that if the landlord bills incorrectly, but it's because of an honest mistake in counting those spaces, that's really not going to count. So it's really those bigger discrepancies that we're looking at, that those are really the things that you're going to want to talk to probably an attorney about. But those smaller ones, again, there's likely going to be some sort of an exception that allows the landlord to get out of that situation, right? If that's the case, it could be something where you simply alert your landlord, hey, I'm noticing that this is the amount of occupied spaces. My bill should have been this. And they might actually be willing to just go ahead and change the pro rata equation to reflect the actual numbers in the park, right? So some of that is literally just the flexibility that occurs because people are moving in and moving out at different times while they're living in the park. So pro rata billing, we've talked about this a bit already. So the amount that the landlord can apportion under pro rata billing must be the amount that's actually charged to the landlord by the service provider. So, if the service provider provides a $5 handling fee for sending hard copy bills, that's not something that they can pass through to the tenants, right? That's what we would call a handling or an administrative cost. If your landlord fails to pay their bill on time and has a late fee, that is an administrative charge. That's not something that they can pass through to tenants, right? So it is supposed to be the amount charged for using the service, right? And not all services are charged by usage. You can think about, say, internet, right? Or cable, those are not charged by usage. You're charged a flat fee, and then you can use as much or as little of it as you want in the month, right? So we're not always talking about usage, but we are always talking about the amount that's actually billed to the landlord, aside from any of those, administrative costs, late fee charges, things like that, that those would be the landlord's responsibility, and they cannot pass those through onto the tenant. The apportionment method, so the way that we're splitting this up in between tenants, that's flexible. The law doesn't say you must do this or this or this. It does include some examples, but you'll notice the language there that says, but is not limited to, and that's really important. That means that there's flexibility, right? So long as the method reasonably allocates the cost among the affected tenants, right? So that means that as long as each tenant that is using that service and being billed for that service is being charged a reasonable amount, like a reasonable share of the full cost, right? The statute does lay out a few different options, and these are, I think the first two are the ones that we see most often. I've never seen the third one take place. It seems like a lot of math, which is maybe why we don't see it very often. Who knows? But some of the most common ways to allocate the cost or split up the cost between the tenants is, as I mentioned before, the number of occupied spaces in the facility. So, if you've got a park of 100 spaces and 3 of those spaces, or, say 5 of those spaces are not occupied right now, then you would be, your landlord would be taking the full amount of that bill and splitting that bill, dividing it by 95, right? Because even though there's 100 spaces in your park, only 95 of them are owner occupied right now, right? Are being rented by someone who owns their home. And so that would be the number that you're dividing that total bill from. Also, the number of tenants or occupants in the dwelling. So I've seen this occur quite a few times. This happens often when this is actually something that tenants will request often, because under the number of occupied spaces in the facility, your usage is not taken into consideration, right? Your usage, if you use less electricity or less water than everyone else, you may be affecting that pot, the big pot, by a little bit, but the amount, it's not affecting your share of the amount, right? Every single person in the park is going to pay the same share under the number of occupied spaces in the facility method. So if your neighbor waters their lawn every morning and every night and is out there watering their flowers every afternoon, and has 3 teenagers who take 3 showers a day, right? They're using clearly way more water than a one individual who doesn't water their lawn and doesn't have a garden and maybe doesn't even have a dishwasher, right? And so that person is paying the same for water as the person with 3 kids who's watering their lawn all day. And so often tenants find that to be unfair, and they would prefer to do something that's more based on usage. And so the number of tenants or occupants in each home kind of correlates to that usage, right? If you have 5 people in your home versus 1 person, the 5-person home is I would say 99.9% of the time going to be using more water than the one person home, right? And so it's a way to try and split up the cost among the tenants that's a little bit more fair and reflects a little bit more accurately the usage of each of those dwellings. The last method that the law lays out, but again, other methods are allowed, is going by the square footage of each dwelling. So basically, you would take the square footage of all the occupied dwellings in the park, and then your square footage. So you have your total amount, and then you basically divide it by the cost. So you figure out how much each square footage would have to pay. And then if your house is, say, 500 square feet and the amount per square foot is $1, then you'd be paying $500, right? So again, these are not accurate numbers. I just am bad at math, so I need to do things that are simple. But so this is just, it's confusing. Calculating the amount of square footage for each dwelling and for the whole park takes time and administrative costs. And I've never seen a landlord do this before, and that's probably why, because it's, and at the end of the day, it's not that accurate anyways, right? Because a lot of water usage occurs outside, watering lawns, washing cars, that kinds of thing. And we're not even counting the rented space here or the lawn or any of that. It's just the actual space of your dwelling. Again, like we mentioned on the last slide, pro rata billing does require that your landlord provide you with that written bill. And those utility charges must be itemized on your bill. So if you're being charged for water, for electricity, for common areas, for garbage, all of that will need to be itemized separately on that bill that they provide to you. You also have the wrong page. You also have the opportunity to inspect your utility bills. We talked about this on the last slide as well, but this is really the key to you being able to determine whether or not your landlord is following the law and apportioning the amount correctly. Landlords have to post those bills in common areas or online for each billing cycle. And upon written request, you can inspect the past 12 months. But again, your landlord is not required to let you take those documents with you. They're required to allow you to inspect them. So look at them, and they can do that either in their office, or they can set up a time to meet you at a coffee shop, right? So it just, the law requires that they set up a time and date and location to meet with you for you to inspect those bills. The law does not require that they provide you copies of those bills. So sub-meter billing, this is really the law is kind of pushing towards sub-meter billing. As I mentioned prior, water is a lot more expensive than it used to be. And we've seen, it's just empirical data shows that people are more likely to conserve water when they are billed for water based on their usage. And so that's why sub-meter billing does kind of have a preference under the law. And I'll talk a little bit about the impacts that preference for sub-meter billing has on tenants, because there are some pretty significant impacts for tenants, because the legislature prefers the sub-meter billing and wants to incentivize landlords to move to this sub-meter billing. So under sub-meter billing, tenants are billed for their usage. There is a sub-meter on your space. The utility is provided, again, to the landlord, and that utility is calculated by a master meter. And then, when it's provided to the landlord, it's provided directly to each space, but the landlord is the one that's receiving the bill. Then the landlord uses those individual meters to read your individual usage on your space, and then they will charge you for that usage. Now, the rate that your landlord is allowed to charge you cannot be higher than the average rate for utility usage billed by the service provider over the last year. Again, this does not include those base or service charges or administrative costs. this is, what you'll be billed for water, you'll be billed for that usage. If there are other costs associated here, that they need to be itemized on your bill. So like I mentioned, the landlord is allowed to charge additional costs for utility or service costs when they use sub-meter billing, particularly for water. So your landlord can include a pro rata share of the storm or wastewater cost that the landlord or that the service provider charges the landlord. But that's only if that amount charged by the service provider is based on the total usage of water provided, right? So that's to say, if the utility provider says, okay, we provided 100 gallons of water, that means that there's 100 gallons of wastewater, right? And so if those numbers, if the usage and the number and the amount they're charging you for wastewater are related, so if you use more, you're getting charged more for wastewater, then your landlord is allowed to split that cost up in a pro rata way, right? So as long as it fairly splits up the cost between all the tenants, they're allowed to do that and include that on your utility bill. Any public service charges are allowed to be on your utility bill, and that's true across the board. But again, those have to be stated separately. Public service charges are generally like sort of a tax, right, from the county. It's something that you would be charged by generally by the city or the county. And yeah, 90.570 does talk a little bit more about that. I'm not going to talk about it because it's pretty obvious when these things come through. Again, your landlord can charge you a pro rata share of your common area utilities, but only if that is in your rental agreement, or under one specific circumstance. Any base or service charge billed to the service provider, they are allowed to recoup that cost, but again, it can't be in that usage amount. It can't be in your water amount, right? They're not allowed to split that up in that way. They have to separately itemize it, explain this is the base or service charge charged by eWeb, and then your pro rata share. Now we're getting into a little bit of these impacts on tenants for this preference for sub-meter billing. If your landlord uses a third-party service provider, so the most common one that I've seen is called Sub-Meter Solutions. If your landlord is using a company like Sub-Meter Solutions who read the water bills and are the ones that issue the tenants the bill and collect the money from the tenant, right? That this third party does all of those things that the landlord would normally be responsible for doing, then the landlord is allowed to charge tenants a pro rata share of the cost for employing that third party. Again, that has to be on your bill, and it's not that cost is like the monthly cost to hire that company to provide the service of reading meters and billing tenants. It can't include additional things like maintenance that was done during that month or repair costs that were needed during that month, right? It has to just be for the service of reading the meters and billing the tenants. This third party also must allow tenants to inspect their billing records. So that same inspection requirement applies to this third party. Unfortunately, the third party does not have to post their utility bills, but if you request a utility bill from the third party, they are required to allow you to review those utility bills. And I'll say, I actually very recently worked with Sub-Meter Solutions. We believe there might have been an overpayment, and they were lovely to work with. They provided all of the readings and documents, and were super helpful. So I can attest that the main third party that's doing this in Oregon is following this and is allowing people to inspect their bills. Of course, I'm an attorney, not a tenant, and I often get different reactions from landlords or from companies that landlords work with than tenants do. So if you attempt to get your records from Sub-Meter Solutions and you're facing a bunch of or not just Submeter Solutions, but any third party, and you face a bunch of pushback, again, that's something where you might want to reach out to an attorney and cite a law in your letter to them. But generally, my experience has been relatively pleasant with these companies. And unfortunately, the landlord does not have a duty to. The landlord does not have a duty to inspect the meters for accuracy. So when a landlord installs submeters on the space, there's a 3-month trial period at that time that it converts to submeter billing. During that period, the landlord is providing the tenant with mock-up bills that actually reflect the usage and what they would be charged under submeter billing, but the tenant is not actually paying those bills. They're just being able to see, okay, this is what my monthly usage looks like. This is what these additional charges are. So this is what I would be needing to pay every month for utilities and services. So during those 3 months, if the tenant is noticing that there are that their usage is way higher than they expected it to be, or that things look off, that's really the time that you need to be reporting that to the landlord. The landlord does have a duty to make sure that those meters are working accurately during that 3-month trial period, but after that 3-month trial period, they no longer have the duty to test the meters for accuracy. That does not mean that they don't have a duty to maintain the submeters. They do. So if you notice that your submeter is no longer working, or you believe that it's overreading or underreading, although I don't know why you would tell your landlord about an underreading meter, but if it's overreading, right, you can tell your landlord that, make a written repair request, and they are required to maintain those submeters. So if your submeter is broken, they do have to maintain it. They just don't have to do regular tests to make sure that it is working properly. So something that I get asked a lot is, can my landlord change the utility billing method without my consent or agreement? So generally speaking, under landlord-tenant law, landlords cannot unilaterally amend a rental agreement. However, the law does allow your landlord to unilaterally change the method of your utility billing in a few ways. Now, again, remember, we talked about how the legislature has a preference towards billing for usage, and that, generally speaking, there is a preference for water conservation, and we believe that water conservation is best accomplished through billing people for their usage of water rather than a flat fee. So you'll see, so that's kind of why the landlord, or why the legislature allows the landlord to, again, unilaterally change. So change without your consent, without your agreement. You don't have to sign anything. You don't have to like it. Your landlord can just do it. They can change your utility billing method for water and wastewater billing only if your existing method is rent included billing. Can they change it to pro rata, right? Or they can change it to submeter if it's rent included. If the existing method is already pro rata billing, then your landlord can use these statutes to change to submeter billing. Your landlord cannot use these statutes to change from submeter billing to rent included billing. Can't do it. You have to start off either at rent included billing or pro rata billing for your landlord to be able to use these statutes to convert your water billing method. And again, like I mentioned, the point of all of this, right, is to encourage water conservation. And so it makes no sense to allow your landlord to change from a method that would, help conserve water to a method that does not help preserve water, right? So if you kind of have that in your mind when you're thinking about these statutes, they tend to make a little bit more sense about why there are these restrictions in place. Your landlord may also unilaterally change your water service billing method. If your existing method is rent included billing or pro rata billing, your landlord may change to direct billing. There are limitations and requirements. So if your landlord wants to use one of these statutes to change your utility billing method without your consent, then they're going to have to follow the process. Sorry, some issues. There we go. So the process and legal requirements for converting your water billing method differ based on whether you're starting off with rent included billing or you're starting off with pro rata billing. We're not going to go over all of the differences or all of the scenarios because it's honestly just a little bit confusing. And I think that the better, more helpful thing to do is to make sure that you know some of the basic requirements that apply to any of these situations. And then we'll go over some of the main differences between conversion from rent included to conversion from pro rata. And I'll also just note that, like I mentioned, the law sets forth the different requirements for the different conversion methods. And that can be confusing, and landlords are not exempt from confusion. So, part of the reason why I'm not going to go over all of this in super detail as well is because oftentimes your landlords aren't using the right statute either, right? And so really what you need to do as a tenant is be able to identify that your landlord is attempting to convert your water billing method, and then ensure that your landlord is doing some of these basic things that apply to all situations. And if you see in those situations, if you see that landlord's not doing some of those basic things, I think that's a good time to give legal aid a call, and see if you can't get someone to help look at the situation, because like I mentioned, they're complicated. They're complicated for anyone, including me, who only ever looks at this part of the law, right? And so yeah, it's not super easy to get right. And so so really what you want to do is just in your mind say, landlord is attempting to bill for water. This is my existing billing method. This is what they're trying to do to change it. And did they do the rest of the stuff on this slide, right? Did they hold that meeting? Did they deliver the notice? And if those things are not being met, that's again, call your local legal aid office, because it seems if they're not doing what's on this slide right here, then they've done something wrong. So, all right. So again, these always apply to the unilateral water billing changes. So at least 1 month prior to conversion, the landlord has to deliver a written notice that describes that they want to change the water billing method, what that new method is, the reason for changing the method, and the process and schedule for the change. This notice also must include the date, time, and location of the meeting that we're going to talk about in number 3. At the same time they deliver that notice, they are to deliver an OHCS handout on utility billing, not unity billing. That's a typo. And and that's a pretty extensive document that explains, what we're discussing here in great detail, and may or may not be useful to your own understanding, right? Like I mentioned, it is very extensive. And so if you get it, you read it and you're confused, and you don't believe that your landlord is holding the meeting or delivered the notice correctly, again, that's a time where you can reach out to your local legal aid office and discuss that conversion and see if your landlord's doing it correctly. As I mentioned, so the written notice must include the date, time, and location of this meeting. So landlord is also required to hold a meeting with tenants at least one month prior to the conversion. At that meeting, the landlord needs to explain the change in billing method, answer questions regarding the utility and service billing, and distribute a sample utility and service charge statement. So distribute a sample bill. And that bill has to include an explanation of each entry on the charge for the charge or the statement, right? So basically what it would say is, you know, water, and this is the estimated time, right? And then there would be an explanation to say, this is your charge for your water usage. Usage is measured by your sub-meter, right? Like there would be a small explanation of what that charge is. If they are now charging you for common areas, right, then it would say common area water and put that pro rata amount. And then the explanation would need to say, pro rata amount for common area utilities. So it has to explain each charge on there. And during that meeting, you should be able to look at that bill and ask questions about that bill, ask questions about the charges. Oh, I keep going backwards. There we go. All right. So like I mentioned, actually, let me go back for a second. So this is what has to happen every single time. Anytime your landlord is attempting to change your water billing method without your approval or your consent, they must do this stuff here. The next slide applies only when we're converting from rent-included billing to pro rata billing. Like I mentioned, the different types of billing conversions have different requirements. So we're going to talk about these because this is one of the main differences. If you're converting from rent-included billing to pro rata billing, your landlord actually does have a duty to conduct testing of the utility or service line. As we talked about before, your landlord does not have a duty to test your sub-meters, right? But that's under sub-meter billing. So here we're talking about pro rata billing, meaning the landlord receives one bill from the service provider and then splits that bill up among tenants based on the amount of occupied spaces, the amount of occupants in each dwelling, right? Depending on their pro rata method. Under pro rata, they have to conduct testing of the utility or service lines, the water utility or service lines at the time they convert to pro rata billing, as well as every 3 years following that conversion. They have to make those testing results available to tenants, and this testing is not required inside of the home, right? Because the home is owned by the tenant. They don't have to do it inside the home. There's no duty for the landlord to do these tests inside the home. Landlord also has to fix any leaks that they find through that testing within a reasonable time. Again, those leaks would have to be fixed in any common areas, in any, up to your rented space, up to the connection to your home, right? But not within your home. If there's a leak inside your home, that is your responsibility. The other very unique thing about conversion from rent included, and this again only includes rent included billing. So only when you start at rent included billing will this apply. That your landlord is required to reduce your rent. So if they're switching from rent included to pro rata, you used to pay $575 a month for rent, and that included all of your utilities. But now you're going to be paying a portion of the park's utilities, right? In addition to your space rent. Well, that's kind of a windfall for landlord if they get to collect the same amount of rent and they get to collect those utilities on top of that, right? And so the way that the law kind of protects tenants from that windfall is that it requires the landlord to reduce the tenant's rent on a pro rata basis, meaning that your landlord essentially has to look at over the past year, how much money were they, what portion of your rent amount was going towards utilities every month, right? And so if you paid $575 and your landlord was generally using $50 of that money to pay the utility bill, then they should be reducing your rent by $50, right? The way that you can find that out is that you look at the utility bills provided to the landlord, and then you divide that, by the amount of tenants in the park. Or not, excuse me, by the amount of occupied spaces in the park. And then that will give you the amount that, the amount of rent or the amount from each space every for those utilities that needed to be paid in order to pay the whole bill, right? So I feel like I explained that confusingly, and if there's questions, I'm happy to answer those. But so landlords are allowed to get out of this because, the law loves to provide us with exceptions and those fun little loopholes. Basically, if the landlord, the landlord has a right to raise your rent every single year, right? And so if the amount of money that they were paying towards utilities every month from your rent was about $50, and so they would have to reduce your rent by $50 every month, but they were allowed to do a rent increase in a couple months or that year, right? What they could do is say, rather than reducing your rent by $50 a month, when we raise our rent next, we will raise it by $50 less than we were allowed to. So if they were allowed to raise your rent, say $75, they can avoid reducing your rent when they convert from rent included to pro rata. If they basically agree and don't raise your rent that full 75, they can only then raise it that 25, right? Because you basically are already paying that rent increase by paying that $50, because that $50 used to pay for your utilities, and now you're paying for utilities separately and that $50. So that's kind of the way that your landlord can get out of it, is by reducing lowering a future rent increase by that required amount, rather than reducing your rent in December and then raising your rent back, back in January, right? So they reduce it by $50 in December, and then, you get a rent increase notice that's increasing your rent by that 75. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. You're going down, you're going up. And so that's why they let landlords do that. When the landlord is calculating this amount that they need to reduce your rent, they must provide written documentation that is from the actual service provider that shows their costs over the past year. So generally that's going to be the bills that they've received, right? And again, tenants already have the right to inspect these bills because, or under pro rata billing, tenants would have the right to inspect these bills moving forward. But under rent included billing, there's not really that requirement. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about conversion to sub-meter billing. So we were just talking about the specific situation of converting from rent included to pro rata billing, so that was our previous subject. Our current subject right now is talking about converting to sub-meter billing. The first subject here applies to any time a landlord converts to sub-meter billing. It doesn't matter if you've converted from pro rata billing. It doesn't matter if you've converted from rent including. This is going to apply. So after the installation of the sub-meters, but before you receive your first bill based on that sub-meter billing, the landlord must conduct a 3-month trial period. So we talked a little bit about this before, but essentially that during that trial period, your landlord has to provide each tenant with a bill that reflects what your bill would actually look like when you start being billed under that sub-meter billing method. But you're not responsible to pay that bill during these 3 months, right? It's supposed to be giving you an example of number one, what those bills are going to look like, what charges are going to be included on those bills, and what your usage is going to look like. This is a really important time to inform your landlord of any leaks or meter issues. Again, this is the time where your landlord does have an affirmative duty to be testing for leaks and testing for accuracy during these 3 months. After that time, there's no affirmative duty to test for those, to test for issues with the sub-meter, but your landlord does have the duty to maintain them should there be an issue. So again, when you see issues, if there's an issue with your sub-meter, if there's an issue with any kind of issue where you believe that a repair is needed, you do have to submit a written repair request to your landlord. That basically just says, hi, landlord, my name is tenant in space blank, and I have noticed that X is broken or Y needs to be repaired. Please take this as my reasonable accommodation or my reasonable repair request, right? And then sign your name and send that to your landlord. It needs to be in writing, so either a letter mailed to your landlord's space, an email, a text, that's fine, but it does need to be in writing. So now the second point here applies only if you're converting to sub-meter billing from rent included billing. And again, this is the whole reduction of rent. So, and it makes sense, right? Because prior to this conversion, you were paying for your utilities. A portion of your rent was paying for utilities. So it doesn't make sense that you should still be paying the same rent amount and in addition to paying for utilities on top of that, right? That's a windfall for the landlord. And so that's why this part of the law is included when you're converting from rent included, either to pro rata or to sub-meter billing. So what we discussed on the last slide does apply. So if they lower the amount of their next rent increase, then they can get out of that rent. They can get out of the rent reduction. Or if they decide that at the same time that they convert, so at the same time that they're converting the water billing for the individual space to a sub-meter, they can convert to pro rata billing for common areas. Again, this is only from rent included billing to sub-meter billing. So if you had previously rent included billing, your landlord can, at the same time that they issue you that notice and hold the meeting with you to discuss the change in utility billing method, they would include in that notice that they are also converting billing for common areas from rent included billing to pro rata billing. So if they choose not to do that, right, if they just change your water billing for your individual space from rent included to sub-meter, then they are allowed to offset that rent reduction basically to an amount equal to tenants' pro rata share of 20% of the park's total bill. So the law just basically says, we think that common areas equal 20% of a utility bill. So that's what that number is. But so essentially the way that you would find out what this amount is you would take the full bill charged to the landlord, take 20% of that, take this, and then divide that pro rata between all of the tenants, and that would become your common area billing share. If, like I said, if your landlord does not choose to convert that pro rata billing for the common areas and keeps the common areas at rent included billing, they can offset the rent reduction by that amount, right? So by the 20% divided up by all of the tenants. So it would be, generally speaking, we're talking about the amount of occupied spaces. So if 20% is $20, you have 20 spaces, each space would be paying $1, right? So that's kind of how that would look. So again, if they don't have each space pay that $1, pay that pro rata share, then they can use that amount that the tenant would be paying had they converted the billing for common areas. They can use that amount and offset their required rent reduction by that amount, right? So again, you're going to use that same method here to determine how much rent needs to be reduced. And then you would use this method here. You would subtract this amount from the prior amount, and that would be the amount that your rent needs to be reduced. Again, this is confusing. I know that. So I don't expect anyone to take this away and be able to do all of this math and understand all of this. What I'm really hoping is that you'll have the tools to kind of, your ears will perk up, or a red flag will kind of pop up where when you're saying, okay, well, I know I was at rent included billing and we're converting to something else, and my landlord hasn't said anything to me about a rent reduction. That should be a red flag, right? Because they do have to explain to you the offset, right? They can't just do it all behind the scenes, right? And so that's really what I'm hoping to achieve today, is to get into your guys' minds enough what some of the requirements are, not all of the details of those requirements, but that requirement exists. And then when you're seeing that your landlord isn't doing that thing, that can be a trigger for you to reach out to your local legal aid office, to MMCRC, right? To have somebody else take a look at what's going on, because they're probably doing something wrong, right? And so that's the goal, right? Is that we can just get enough information into your heads that when a situation like this occurs, that you have that wherewithal and enough information about your rights to know if something is being violated. Not enough to know how to file a complaint by yourself. No one's expecting you guys to go up there and sue your landlords all on your own. Definitely not expecting that. What we are hoping to achieve is that you guys will be able to identify when something's going on early enough that you can contact an attorney, and that we can do something about it before either the statute of limitations runs out, or something else occurs, right? All right. So one of the other processes or legal requirements under the law for conversion to sub-meter billing, and this is true for conversion from rent included or from pro rata. So anytime you're converting to sub-meter billing, your landlord is allowed to recover the cost of installing those sub-meters from you guys, the tenants. So that cost includes the installation costs. It also includes any repairs or improvements that were necessary to the infrastructure of the utility system in order to install the sub-meters, right? So it can't just be like, oh, we want to replace these pipes, right? No, it has to be, you can't install the sub-meter on that space with that size of pipe, because it's not compatible with the sub-meter. So it requires you to make a repair or an improvement to the system, because the sub-meters won't work with the system without those repairs or improvements. It can only be actual costs to the landlord. So the landlord can't just add random things. The landlord's not allowed to benefit financially from this. They're just supposed to be able to recover the costs. The landlord must provide each tenant with a copy of that payment plan, and that has to occur 90 days before the first payment is due. Your landlord cannot start charging these payments before the installation of the sub-meters is complete, and your landlord cannot start charging you these payments more than 6 months after installation. So essentially, your landlord has a period of 6 months right after installation to 6 months after installation to provide you with that 90-day notice and begin collecting these payments from you. If your landlord fails to provide that notice, fails to provide the notice and start the payments within those 6 months, then they're not allowed to recoup these costs, right? So that's their deadline for providing the notice and beginning the payments. So the amount, the frequency, and the length of these payments. So again, it's a pro rata method of apportioning the landlord's costs. So you're going to take all of the costs that to install the sub-meters, the sub-meters themselves, the labor, any of the repairs that were necessary, right? Put that all into a big pot. And then we're going to go ahead and break that pot up by a number of occupied spaces or by number of occupants in the park. And that's going to give you, your pro rata amount. That's what you're going to be paying at least, or no more frequently than every month. And it has to be over a period of at least 60 months, right? So if you take the full cost say it's $10,000 and you have 10 tenants, each tenant would be ultimately responsible for that $1,000, but you would split that $1,000 up over, so you would divide 1,000 by 60, right? And then that would give you your monthly payment. Generally, I've seen these payments be anywhere between like $4.95 to like $17 a month. So it really kind of depends, on how many improvements or repairs were needed to your utility system, how many sub-meters there were, right? Like, so the cost really does differ depending on the park, and depending on what their existing utility infrastructure looked like, because, as we know, some of these parks are pretty old, and that utility infrastructure is also very outdated. And so that switch to pro rata billing, or excuse me, that switch to sub-meter billing does require an updating of the system. And so this is something that, again, reflects that intention, to conserve water and, to incentivize landlords to switch to sub-meter billing. That's why this exists, right? If landlords had to pay for the cost of the sub-meters completely out of pocket and were not able to recoup this cost, we likely would not see sub-meters in parks. It's expensive, and of course, landlords are in the business of making money. And so that's why the legislature included this, is to incentivize that switch to sub-meters. And having talked to some of the people who actually drafted these laws, tenants actually were in favor of creating systems where we can switch over to sub-meter, because again, they felt that their usage was not really being reflected in their bill, and that they were conserving lots of water, but their bill was just as high as people who were not conserving water. And so many tenants were very excited about having sub-meters, because they were then able to have more control over the cost of their utilities, right? Again, unfortunately, this is just one of those compromises that had to be made in the law, where in order to make conversion to sub-meter billing more likely, there had to be a mechanism for landlords to recover those costs. I do think that because it's over of a period of at least 60 months, that does provide, that makes it a little bit more feasible for tenants to be able to pay that amount. Like I said, it's generally less than $20 a month. I've not seen one be more than $20 a month. These payments must be itemized separately on your utility bill. Again, like we talked about, each different type of utility needs to be listed differently on that bill. And there was one more thing I wanted to say about this. Can't remember. Yeah, I mean, I think that basically, apologies. All right, there we go. So yeah, that's basically the gist of it. Again, this does impact tenants financially, but landlords do have to follow the procedure and provide that notice at least 90 days before the first payment is due. And yeah, so it is an unfortunate part of the law, and tenants are not always excited about this part. But I do think that it's really important that tenants know that this part of the law exists, because oftentimes, tenants are excited about switching to sub-meter billing until they go to that meeting and learn about this recovery statute. So it's important to know, if you are wanting sub-meter billing in your park, it is very, very likely that you're going to be paying a special assessment fee every month after the installation of those sub-meters to pay your landlord back for the cost of installing them. Also important to note that the payment plan attaches to the rented space and not the tenant. So if the tenant moves out, so say you sell your home, 10 months into this agreement, you sell your home and someone else moves in. Well, you're not going to have to pay this special assessment once you don't live in the park for the next 50 months, right? No, that's crazy. The the payment plan will attach to your space, and the person who purchased your home and became a tenant in the park will now have to pay that special assessment for the next 50 months, right? And again, if they sell within those 50 months, the new tenant who takes over will take over that payment plan. And payments, once the payment plan has been, once the full amount has been paid, then payments have to stop, right? It doesn't attach forever. It just attaches until that entire amount is paid. So the other way that your landlord may unilaterally change your utility billing is in the garbage billing method. They may convert to direct billing, and this is from rent included or pro rata billing. This is only applies if the service provider supplies garbage receptacles to tenants, collects and disposes of that garbage, and either bills the tenant directly or bills the landlord, who then bills the tenant based on the number and size of the receptacles used. So this is how how most garbage service works, where you'll receive either a large garbage can, a small garbage can, a medium-sized garbage can, and that garbage is collected weekly, and depending on the size of your garbage, you're going to be charged differently, right? You have the biggest garbage can, you're going to be charged the most. So that's, that's how we're basing the cost of it, right? If the landlord wants to do this, they have to provide tenant at least 180 days written notice. So, they can't just one day decide to convert their garbage billing, right? If they do change their service provider or change, from having big garbage, like garbage canister type situations versus having individual ones. If your landlord is doing that based on the service provider, that's fine, but they can't change the way that they bill you for it unless this applies, unless they provided that 180 days written notice and the service provider meets those requirements. It's also important to note that the landlord can't convert the garbage method less than a year after giving notice of a rent increase. So, if you just received a rent increase, a lot of people receive them in September to take effect in January. So if you've received that, right, and that's your situation, your landlord cannot change your garbage method, without your consent, until probably the following, it would be like October, right? And so until after that notice had a year after they have issued that notice. If you're converting from rent included billing, so again, this applies to both pro rata and rent included billing conversions to direct billing. If you're coming from rent included billing, then the landlord does have that duty to reduce your rent by amount comparable to the previous amount that they would spend on that utility. Previous amount of your rent that they would spend on that utility. This is the same principle that we've discussed in previous slides. That, the way that they figure out that amount is they look at the past year of bills, and how much money, how much those bills cost, how many people are on rent included billing, and then figure out the share of the rent that was going to those utilities. Again, it's not the most simple math, so don't feel bad if you're confused. This is the type of stuff that the attorney would be handling. The part that you really need to have a grasp on is that if I'm being converted from rent included billing to pro rata, to submeter, or to direct billing, then my landlord is going to have to reduce my rent, or have some kind of an offset that allows them to not reduce my rent. But there's going to have to be a conversation about that rent reduction, or a notice about the rent reduction. If that doesn't occur, that's your trigger, right? Another way that your landlord may convert the utility billing method for water is by holding a park-wide vote. So this requires tenant consent. So it's not a unilateral change. Your landlord does have to get the consent of a majority of tenants. Your landlord has to hold a park-wide vote. And in that park-wide vote, each space is allowed to cast only one vote. The ballot must contain an opportunity to vote against any change. And the ballot can contain two new methods. So if you're on say you're on rent included billing, and your landlord gives you a ballot that says, do you want to change to pro rata billing? Do you want to change to sub-meter billing? They also have to include a third option that says, do you want to keep your current billing, right? So no matter what, if the ballot has more than one choice for conversion, there has to be that option to vote against both of the options, right? So they have to have an option on this ballot to say, I want to keep our existing billing method. Notice is required again, so at least 1 month prior to the vote, landlord must deliver a notice. Same kind of thing that we talked about previously for those requirements to change the water, right? A notice that requires their intention to change the method, the new proposed method, the reason for the conversion, and the process and schedule for the conversion, including the date, time, and location of the meeting that's required. And again, at least 1 month prior to the vote, the landlord must hold a meeting with tenants, distribute a mock-up bill, and an explanation for each entry. If the landlord is going to contain two options of conversion, so two different methods of conversion on their ballot, at that meeting, they need to, that mock bill does need to reflect both of those options, right? So if there's a pro rata option and then there's a sub-meter option, you would have to provide a mock-up bill for both of those options, right? Because otherwise tenants can't make an informed decision about what they'd like to do if they're only receiving a mock-up of one of the options. Another instance where your landlord can add utility charges is for, excuse me, yawn, sorry, is for cable television, direct satellite video subscription services, or internet access. Oh my gosh, whenever I click on it. I'm so sorry. There we go. This is only true if that additional amount is not more than 10% of the tenant's utility bill. So basically that means if you're looking at your prior utility bill, you'd add up all of those utility costs, the utility charges on that bill, and this additional amount can't be more than 10% of that total bill cost, right? So if you're paying water, electric, garbage, and common areas, right? Then you would add those things up. That's your total bill. This cost can't be more than 10% of that bill. Also, that the total utility charge and the additional amount is less than the typical cost the tenant would incur if they received the service directly. This just means like if you can't be charging, you know, if under your utility billing methods, the tenant is paying way more than they would be paying if they just signed up for Netflix themselves, if they just had internet themselves, if they, just did these things, themselves directly with the service provider. If what the landlord is doing is charging them more than that for these same services, then that's not going to work, right? So the point is that if the landlord is providing some kind of cable, satellite, video subscription, or internet, is that it actually benefits the tenants of the park, right, by sharing those services. So it shouldn't, if you get your own internet from Comcast, that should cost more than sharing internet with your park, right? So if it doesn't, if if sharing the internet with your park somehow is more than doing it yourself, then we've got a problem here, and for sure. The written rental agreement has to describe these charges or this additional amount, and that has to be separately from other utility or service charges. So again, your written rental agreement is going to have everything about your utility billing in it. It has to be stated there in your written rental agreement. The things that we have talked about previously, other than the voting method, are ways that your landlord can amend that rental agreement regarding utilities by themselves. Other than those specific things that we talked about, your landlord is not allowed to change the method of utility billing in your rental agreement without your consent, right? So, as it says here, if your landlord wants to amend the rental agreement to include this additional fee, you don't have to agree. Your landlord does not have a right to do this by themselves. It requires mutual agreement, right? If your landlord is offering this and you say, no, thank you, your landlord cannot terminate your rental agreement. So if your landlord if your landlord says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to add internet, this is how much it's going to cost you, and you say, no, I'm good, I don't want that. And then your landlord provides you with a notice of termination for cause, give a legal aid lawyer a call, because that's definitely not allowed. They cannot force you to amend your rental agreement regarding utilities other than those specific instances that we've already talked about. And I'd like to note that there is not a duty to provide internet or cable or satellite. Your landlord just does not have a duty to provide those things. However, if they do provide them at the beginning of your rental agreement, then they need to be providing those adequately, right? So can your landlord make you pay for common area utilities? Yes, they can, but only if it is stated clearly in your written rental agreement. So essentially in the section on utility billing, it would need to say, have like a section for common areas and explain that you will be charged for a pro rata share of the common area utilities, and explain what, how that pro rata apportionment is going to work. Is that by rented space? Is that by occupant? Right? So that needs to be explained in your rental agreement. Any common area utility charge needs to be separately itemized on your bill. So, your water charge is X amount, common area utility charge X amount, right? It needs to be separately stated on that bill. Your landlord cannot unilaterally amend this part of your rental agreement. So your landlord cannot force you to agree to pay for common area utilities once you've already signed a rental agreement. So long as that's not in your current rental agreement, they cannot make you agree to pay for those common area utilities by themselves, right? You can agree to it yourself. I don't know why you would do that. Probably don't, but yeah, so your landlord cannot force you, can't evict you for failing to agree to it. The one exception is that if your landlord is converting from rent included billing, only rent included billing, to sub-meter billing for water, at that same time, they are allowed to convert the common area water bill from rent included to pro rata billing. We talked about this a little bit before, but basically your landlord's going to have to follow all of those notice requirements, providing the bill requirements, all of that for both the transition for your space to sub-meter billing from rent included and for common area billing, right? So the notice would have to say, it's my intention to convert your water billing from rent included to sub-meter billing for your rented space, and to convert common area utility billing from rent included to pro rata. And this is the pro rata apportionment method that we'll use, right? So that has to be set forth and explained very clearly in the landlord's notice and their sample bills that occur at that beginning stages of the conversion, right? That are required to happen 1 month before the conversion occurs. If your landlord does not include this language does not include their intention to convert the common area water billing from rent included to pro rata in those initial meetings, in the initial notice and initial meeting, then they are foreclosed from doing so, right? They have one legal method for unilaterally converting that common area utility billing, and it is only if they do it at the same time and meet the requirements as they're converting from rent included billing for water to sub-meter billing for water. So again, there's a lot of extra rules here when we're talking about rent conversion from rent included billing. And I think that if we think about it logically, it does make sense, right? Because a portion of your rent was previously used to pay for those utilities. So continuing to pay that full amount plus utilities is a windfall to landlord. So we're going to have to talk about rent reductions and rent offsets under rent included billing conversions. And also you're going to have, you have the impact of a conversion for the common areas when you're converting from rent included to sub-meter billing. Again, this is the only time that your landlord can require you to start paying for common area utilities. Unless that's stated in your rental agreement, your landlord cannot require you to pay for those common area utilities. And they can't require you to sign a new agreement. They can't do that, right? So once you've got a month-to-month rental agreement with the park, that continues to go on throughout time, right? And they can't require unilateral changes, so they can't say, accept this change or you're evicted. They just can't do that except for under very certain circumstances with certain processes and procedures like we saw previously. Again, can my landlord evict me for failure to pay a utility or service charge? We talked about this briefly at the beginning of this presentation, but yes, they can. Failure to pay a utility or service charge is grounds for termination for cause under 90.630. The landlord must serve a 30-day written termination notice. The notice must give you 30 days to pay the utility charge and avoid termination. That's what we call cure. The notice must also include a handout from the judicial department regarding rent and legal assistance. And if the termination notice expires and your landlord files an eviction case with the courts, the law does give you a right to pay that past due amount and avoid eviction up until trial. We talked about this a little bit previously. You can't pay it during trial. You can't pay at the end of trial when you realize you've lost. You got to pay it before that trial starts. Failure to pay a utility or service charge, again, is not grounds for termination of non-payment of rent under 90.394, only termination for cause, right? Because utility and service charges are not rent. So what happens if your landlord violates these rules? Well, then you've got a legal claim. So the damages that are included in this little chunk of statutes is tenant can recover the greater of 1 month's rent or twice the actual damages, including any amount wrongfully charged. These claims don't accrue for each instance of the landlord's violation. So let's say that a tenant was wrongfully charged, or there was a violation that occurred every single month for a year. That tenant is only entitled to either 1 month's rent or twice the actual damages. The fact that that violation occurred every month for 12 months does not entitle the tenant to 12 months of rent and damages, right? It's not, each claim, the violation of these statutes provides you with the one claim. So even if you can prove multiple violations, if you're suing those multiple violations in one claim, you've got damages for 1 month's rent. This just came out of the Court of Appeals or Supreme Court. I can't remember which one, which court was it that decided, but we did just get a decision that basically states this principle that the statute's very clear. You get the greater of 1 month's rent or twice the actual damages, and the amount of um, the recurrence of that violation doesn't entitle the tenant to additional damages. So we just got that case, I want to say a couple months ago. It's an unfortunate decision, but there you have it. Again, something to note here is that the Oregon Residential Landlord Tenant Act is civil law, right? So there's no enforcement agency or oversight agency for landlords. There's no police for landlords. There's no one that's gonna, go find them or give them a violation notice. That's just not what that doesn't occur in civil law, right? Civil law is enforced by civilians. So basically you would need to enforce your rights through the courts by filing either a civil case or a small claims case against your landlord. I highly suggest that you don't do that on your own. I always suggest that if you think you have a claim against your landlord, that you should reach out to an attorney. As I mentioned, there are legal aid offices, either Legal Aid Services of Oregon or the Oregon Law Center, that serve every single county in the state of Oregon. If you go to www.oregonlawhelp.org, there is an interactive map on that site that will help you find your the right legal aid office for you. There's also a modest means attorney referral program with the Oregon State Bar. That program will allow you to request a referral for a specific issue, and attorneys throughout the state have signed up to this program, and they agree that they'll hold an initial consultation with those referrals for $30. After that initial consultation, the fees are set by that attorney. So while your initial consultation is definitely affordable under that modest needs program, it does not guarantee you affordable representation throughout the life of that case. After that initial $30 consultation, the private attorney will be setting their own prices and working with you on a pay plan. Not all the time do we need to go to court to get damages or resolve claims. Oftentimes more often than not, claims are settled outside of court. There is, mediation is available for facility tenants. Negotiation is always available as well. Often negotiation does work better when you've got an attorney involved. And yeah, so if you think that you've got a claim against your landlord and you're interested in resolving that claim, but you're maybe not so excited about the thought of going to court, you can still reach out to an attorney and discuss your options. Like I said, more often than not, these types of cases resolve outside of court and don't require a lawsuit. The reason for that is that under the Oregon Landlord Tenant Act, there's something called fee shifting, which means whoever wins the case can make the loser pay their attorney's fees. So it can get really expensive to go to court. And so if a landlord knows that you are planning to sue them and you give them a copy of your complaint or a demand letter that explains your position and your claim, right? So what damages you would like or what resolution you would like, and your landlord sees that and sees that that's a valid claim, a good claim that's likely to win in court, they have a high incentive to settle that issue with you outside of court. Because once you're in that courtroom, and even if you retain a legal aid attorney or someone from Oregon Law Center like me, where we don't charge our tenants, we will charge your landlord. So if there's a case, file it with the courts and we win and you've got a legal aid attorney, even though we would not provide our tenants, our clients with a bill, we will, if we win in court, provide your landlord with a bill for our attorney's fees. And landlords know that. So there is an incentive for landlords to try and resolve these things without going to court, because there's that risk that they'll lose and that they will have to pay attorney's fees, which can be in the thousands of dollars, which is often much more than the damages that we're looking at here, which is 1 month's rent. Usually that's going to be less than $1,000 in a park. So if you just think about it logically, the landlord has an incentive to just go ahead and pay out the damages prior to getting sued, because the cost and benefit, it's just really not there. Not only would they have to pay my attorney's fees, but if they hired an attorney, they would also have to pay their fees as well. So it can get very expensive. All right, so that's really the end of the presentation. Again, these utility bill statutes are long and a bit complicated and have a lot of different caveats depending on your existing billing method, the proposed billing method, whether your landlord wants to do it with your approval or without your approval, right? So there's a lot of different processes and procedures depending on the specific circumstances. And so I highly suggest that if you feel like something's going amiss in a utility bill conversion case, please reach out to legal aid or the Oregon State Bar and have an attorney take a peek at that case, because like I said, oftentimes your landlord isn't even using the right statute. So sometimes it just takes it takes some investigation and really looking and researching in the law as well to figure out exactly where your circumstance fits and what those requirements are for them. And we don't have a whole lot of people in the meeting right now, but if anyone is here that's here and would like to ask a question, I'm happy to do that.
Not really.
That means I either confused you a lot or I was thorough.
No, I think you're pretty thorough, and I was curious. Uh, the fact sheet that we had, does that kind of
Hey,
comport
Judy, do you
with?
want to go ahead and stop recording?
Yeah.
No, the